Maya Whitfield's knees hit the marble floor of the third-floor hallway before her mind caught up with what her body already knew, that she had been running on 4 hours of sleep for 6 straight days, and there was nothing left in the tank to give. The cleaning cart beside her rattled from the impact, bottles clinking against each other in the sudden silence, and she pressed her palm flat against the cool stone and breathed through the gray static creeping in at the edges of her vision. 22 years old, and she was already learning what it felt like for a body to simply refuse to continue, and she hated it, hated the weakness of it, because weakness was not something the Han estate had room for. She had taken this job 4 months ago because the pay was absurd for domestic work and because the woman who ran the household staff, a sharp-eyed manager named Priya, had promised her the hours were manageable if she kept her head down and asked no questions. Maya had kept her head down. She had asked no questions, even when the answers were obvious, even when black cars came and went at 3 in the morning, even when certain rooms on the East Wing were permanently off-limits and certain men who visited never gave their names. She cleaned. She organized. She made herself invisible in the particular way that good staff learn to be invisible, present enough to be useful, absent enough to be forgotten. The man who owned the estate was rarely seen and always felt. Maya had passed him in hallways perhaps a dozen times in 4 months, and each time the air in the corridor seemed to thin out around him, every member of staff finding urgent business elsewhere the moment his footsteps sounded on the stairs. He was tall, immaculately dressed even at midnight, and he moved like stillness was a decision he made fresh every single time rather than a natural state. She knew his name because everyone knew his name, spoken carefully and never loudly.
Yehan.
The kind of name that made grown men look at their shoes. She had never spoken to him, not once. And she told herself that was exactly how she wanted it to stay, because whatever business kept black cars arriving at 3 in the morning was not business a smart woman inserted herself into for any reason at all. The static in her vision deepened instead of clearing, and Maya realized with distant, detached alarm that she was not going to make it back to the staff quarters under her own power. Her arms had gone strange and heavy. The hallway tilted just slightly, the way a boat tilts before you understand you're no longer standing on solid ground. The last thing she registered before the floor rushed up to meet her was the sound of a door opening somewhere close, unhurried footsteps, and a voice, low and even, saying something she couldn't quite catch before the world went dark entirely. When awareness returned to her, it came in pieces. The first thing she noticed was warmth, the particular warmth of expensive linens against her skin, softer than anything in the staff quarters had ever been. The second thing she noticed was the quality of the light in the room, gold and low, filtered through curtains that cost more than her monthly salary. The third thing, the thing that made her entire body go rigid with sudden, sharp awareness, was the weight and warmth of a hand wrapped around hers. Maya turned her head slowly on the pillow and found Jae-han asleep in a chair pulled close to the side of the bed, his head tipped back, his eyes closed, one hand curled loosely but deliberately around hers where it rested on the coverlet. He had changed out of whatever he'd been wearing earlier into a white dress shirt left unbuttoned at the collar, ink visible at his throat where the fabric gave way, dark lines disappearing beneath cloth that had clearly been put on in a hurry and worn since, without a second thought for appearance. There was a decanter of amber liquid on the nightstand beside a lamp with a black shade, a glass beside it untouched. He looked, in sleep, entirely unlike the man who emptied hallways with his footsteps. He looked simply tired, in a way that made him seem younger than she had assumed him to be. Maya's heart hammered so hard she was certain it would wake him, and for one long, suspended moment she did not move at all, too afraid that any motion would break whatever strange, fragile thing had happened while she was unconscious, too afraid, in some deeper and more confusing way, that she did not actually want it to break. Then his eyes opened, dark and immediately, fully alert in the way of a man who had never in his life woken slowly, and found hers. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. His hand did not move from hers. "You collapsed in the east hallway," he said finally, his voice low, roughened faintly by sleep, but carrying the same unhurried authority she remembered from the few times she'd overheard him speak to his men. "Dehydration and exhaustion, according to the doctor I had brought in. You've been asleep for 11 hours. Maya's mouth had gone dry. She was intensely, painfully aware of his hand around hers, and of the fact that she was lying in what was unmistakably his bed, and of the fact that she had absolutely no memory of how she had gotten there, only the dim recollection of hallway marble and gray static. "Why am I in your room?" she managed, and was proud of how steady her voice came out, even as her pulse refused to slow. "Because it was closer than the staff quarters, and I did not particularly want to explain to Priya why one of her housekeepers was found unconscious on my floor," he said. There was something almost dry in the way he said it, though his expression gave away nothing at all. "You have not eaten a proper meal in days. Do not think I have not noticed the state of the coffee machine in the staff kitchen. Someone has been running it near empty every morning this week." "I didn't realize you paid attention to the coffee machine," Maya said, before she could stop herself, and immediately regretted the flippancy, because this was not a man staff spoke to that way. This was a man whose name made grown associates look at their shoes. But something shifted in his face, barely perceptible, the faintest suggestion of amusement that did not quite reach a smile. "I pay attention to everything in this house," he said. "It is how I have survived long enough to own it." Only then did he seem to register that his hand was still curled around hers, and Maya watched him notice it, watched the flicker of something unreadable pass behind his eyes as he looked down at their joined hands on the coverlet, as though he was recalculating something he had not intended to reveal. He did not pull away immediately. When he finally did withdraw his hand, it was slow, deliberate, nothing like the reflexive snatch of a man caught doing something he regretted. "You held my hand," Maya said quietly, unable to stop herself from naming it, because pretending it hadn't happened felt like a lie neither of them could afford. "While I was asleep. You were unconscious and alone in a house full of men I do not entirely trust," Jay said, his voice flat and careful in a way that told her the words were true, but not the whole truth. "I did not want you to wake up frightened, not knowing where you were. That's not the same as holding someone's hand for 11 hours. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and Maya had the distinct, unnerving sensation of being read the way she imagined he read every threat and every liar who ever sat across from him at a negotiating table, thoroughly, without mercy, arriving at conclusions he had no intention of sharing. "No," he agreed finally. "It is not." He did not elaborate, and Maya understood, with the particular instinct that had kept her employed and unnoticed in this house for 4 months, that pushing further would break something that was not ready to be examined in the light of a Tuesday morning. She let it go, and reached instead for the glass of water on the nightstand, her hands still slightly unsteady, and Jay watched her drink with an attentiveness that made her skin feel too warm. "You should eat," he said, rising from the chair with the same fluid stillness she remembered from the hallways, as though standing up required no transitional motion at all, simply a change from one state to another. "I will have something sent up. I have work," Maya said automatically, already trying to push the blankets back, though her body protested the motion with a wave of lingering dizziness that made her grip the edge of the mattress. "You have the day off," Jay said, in a tone that made clear this was not a negotiation. "Priya has been informed. You will eat, and you will rest, and tomorrow you may return to pretending you do not run yourself into the ground on my watch." Maya wanted to argue. She wanted to point out that she needed the hours, that missed shifts meant missed pay, that she had rent and a mother back in Cleveland who occasionally needed help with her own bills, but something in the flat, absolute certainty of his voice told her that arguing would accomplish nothing except delay. She sank back against the pillows instead and watched him move toward the door, his shoulders set in that particular way that made rooms empty around him. "Mr. Han," she said, before he reached it. He paused, his hand on the frame, and looked back at her. "Thank you," Maya said, "for not letting me wake up alone on that floor." Something in his expression flickered again, that same brief crack in the composure she was beginning to recognize as the closest thing to warmth this man allowed himself. "Jay," he said, "if you are going to sleep in my bed, you may as well use my name." Then he was gone, the door closing with a soft, precise click, and Maya lay alone in sheets that smelled faintly of cedar and something sharper beneath it, gunmetal or gun oil or something she did not want to examine too closely, and tried to understand why her heart was still racing an hour after she had woken up perfectly safe. The following week passed in a strange, charged quiet. Maya returned to her duties, scrubbing floors and organizing linen closets and making herself invisible in all the ways she had trained herself to be, but something had shifted, subtly, in the geometry of the house. Jay found reasons to be in rooms she was cleaning. Not obviously, not clumsily, but with the same careful precision he seemed to apply to everything, a man reviewing correspondence at the library desk while she dusted the shelves, a man taking a call on the terrace while she watered the potted lemon trees nearby. He never lingered, obviously. He never spoke first. But Maya began to notice the particular weight of his attention, the way his eyes would track her across a room before he schooled his expression back into something unreadable. She told herself it meant nothing. A man like Jae-han did not fall for the help. Whatever strange softness had passed between them in that bedroom was an aberration, a moment of fatigue and vulnerability on both their parts, not the beginning of anything real. She repeated this to herself with the same discipline she applied to every task in that house, and she almost believed it, until the afternoon she overheard something in the East Wing that changed everything. She had gone to retrieve a forgotten cleaning caddy from outside the study, a room she had been warned, in her very first week, never to enter without explicit permission. The door was cracked, not fully closed, and Jay's voice carried through the gap in a tone she had never heard him use before, low and dangerous in a way that made her stomach drop. "Someone inside this house has been feeding information to the Cho family," he said, and Maya froze in the hallway, her hand still on the caddy she had bent to retrieve. "I want to know who before the end of the week. I do not care what it costs." A second voice, one she recognized as belonging to Jay's second-in-command, a broad-shouldered man named Sung-hoon, replied in a murmur too low for her to catch fully, though she heard the word staff, and the word compromised clearly enough to feel her pulse spike with sudden, cold understanding. Someone in this household, someone who moved through the same hallways she moved through every day, was selling information to a rival organization. And if that was true, every person in this house, herself included, was now standing inside a war that could turn lethal at any moment. She retreated as quietly as she could, her mind racing, and told herself it was none of her business, that the wisest course of action was to keep her head down exactly as she always had, and let the dangerous men handle their dangerous business without her. But some part of her, the part that had always refused to simply accept the world as it was handed to her, could not stop turning the conversation over, could not stop wondering who among the staff she had come to know, however distantly, was capable of that kind of betrayal. She got her answer 3 days later, in the worst possible way. Maya was in the east hallway again, the same stretch of marble where she had collapsed weeks earlier, carrying fresh linens toward the guest wing, when she turned a corner and nearly walked directly into a man she did not recognize. He was not staff. His suit was wrong, too flashy for the estate's understated aesthetic, and his eyes moved over her with a calculation that made every instinct in her body scream danger before her mind had finished processing why. "You work for Han," the man said. It was not a question. "I clean for him," Maya said carefully, backing a half step, the linens clutched to her chest like a shield. "I don't know anything about his business." "That's a shame," the man said, and the smile that followed did not reach his eyes at all. "Because you're about to become useful whether you know anything or not." He moved fast, faster than Maya had braced for, and she barely had time to drop the linens and stumble backward before his hand closed around her wrist, hard enough to bruise, dragging her toward the service stairwell at the end of the hall. Maya did not scream, some instinct telling her that screaming would only speed whatever this man intended, and instead she did the only thing she could think to do in the half-second she had, driving her elbow backward into his ribs with every ounce of strength her exhausted body could summon. It was not enough to break his grip, but it was enough to make him stumble, enough to buy her the half-second she needed to wrench free and bolt back down the hallway toward the main house, her heart slamming against her ribs, her bare feet slapping against marble as she ran faster than she had ever run in her life. She burst through the door of the library where she knew, from days of careful, unconscious tracking, that Jay was most likely to be at this hour, and found him exactly there, rising from his desk before she had even finished crossing the threshold, his expression shifting instantly from surprise to something colder and more focused the moment he saw her face. "There's a man," Maya gasped. "In the east hallway. He grabbed me. He said I was useful." Jay moved past her before she finished the sentence, already reaching for something inside his jacket, already calling a name into the hallway that brought two more men running within seconds. Maya followed at a distance, unable to stop herself, and arrived at the east hallway in time to see Jay's men subduing the intruder against the wall, and to see Jay himself standing over the man with an expression of absolute, controlled fury that made the temperature of the hallway seem to drop several degrees. "Who sent you?" Jay said, his voice quiet in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. The man said nothing, and Jay crouched slightly, bringing himself level with the man's face, and repeated the question in exactly the same quiet, patient tone, and Maya understood, watching him, that she was witnessing the version of Jae Han that made grown men look at their shoes in hallways, the version that existed beneath the careful stillness and the tailored suits. The man finally spoke, one word, a name that meant nothing to Maya but that made Jay's jaw tighten visibly. "Jaw." "Take him to the basement," Jay said, straightening, and something in his tone left no room for questions about what would happen next. His men hauled the intruder away, and Jay turned to Maya, his expression shifting again, the fury banking into something more careful, more searching. "Are you hurt?" he said, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides, his hands coming up to frame her face, tilting her chin gently toward the light as though checking for injuries she had not mentioned. "He grabbed my wrist," Maya said, holding it up, and Jay's fingers closed around it with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the coldness he had shown the intruder moments earlier, examining the reddening bruise with a focus that made her breath catch. "This should not have happened inside my own house," he said, and there was something raw beneath the controlled anger in his voice, something that sounded almost like guilt. "You should never have been in danger here." "I overheard you and Sung-hoon in the study," Maya admitted, because it felt wrong to let him think this had come out of nowhere. "Days ago. About someone feeding information to a rival family. I didn't say anything to anyone, I promise you that, but I think that's why he grabbed me. He said I would be useful." Jay's expression darkened further. "Useful as leverage," he said quietly. "Useful as a message. If Cho believes I have grown attached to someone in this house, he will use that against me without hesitation." "Have you?" Maya asked, before she could stop herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grown attached." The hallway around them seemed to go very still. Jay's hand was still wrapped around her wrist, his thumb resting gently over the bruise forming there, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, the same unreadable focus she had first noticed in his bedroom weeks ago, before he finally spoke. "Yes," he said simply, no embellishment, no explanation, exactly the way he seemed to answer every question that mattered. "Against my own judgment, and against every rule I have followed since the day I took over this organization. Yes." Maya's heart was pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with fear now. "That's dangerous," she said. "For both of us." "I am aware," Jay said. "I've been aware since the morning you woke up in my bed and thanked me instead of running." He did not kiss her then. He did not say anything more romantic than what he had already said, but he kept her hand in his as he walked her back toward the main house, past staff who quickly found urgent business elsewhere the moment they saw the two of them together, and something about the simple, deliberate fact of him not letting go told Maya everything she needed to know about how far things had already gone. The days that followed brought attention to the house that Maya could feel in every room she entered. Jay doubled the security around the estate. Sung-hoon and his men moved through the halls with a new grimness, and twice Maya glimpsed black cars arriving at hours that had nothing to do with 3 in the morning, unmarked vehicles disgorging men she did not recognize into meetings that lasted well past midnight. She was told, gently but firmly, to stay within the main house, to avoid the grounds after dark, to report anything unusual immediately. She did not need to be told twice. But staying close to the main house also meant staying close to Jay, and the proximity that had once felt professional now felt charged in a way that made even simple tasks, folding laundry in a room he happened to walk through, arranging flowers on a table he happened to be reading at, feel weighted with a significance neither of them acknowledged aloud. It was in the library, for nights after the attack in the hallway, that the careful distance between them finally collapsed entirely. Maya had come to return a book she had borrowed weeks earlier, one of the few small liberties she allowed herself in this house, and found Jay at his desk with a glass of the same amber liquid she remembered from his nightstand, his jacket discarded over the back of his chair, his shirt sleeves rolled to the forearm in a way that exposed more ink than she had seen before. Dark lines curling from wrist to elbow in patterns she did not recognize but understood, instinctively, told a story he had never shared with anyone outside his organization. "You should be resting," Jay said, without looking up from the papers spread across his desk. "I could say the same to you," Maya replied, setting the book on the shelf where it belonged. "It's past midnight. Sleep and I have an uneasy relationship most nights," he said, and something in the dry, tired honesty of it made Maya pause instead of leaving as she had intended. "Is it Cho?" she asked quietly. "Whatever's keeping you up." Jay set down his pen and finally looked at her, and in the low light of the library, with his guard lowered by exhaustion and whiskey and whatever else had been eating at him for days, he looked younger again, the way he had looked asleep in the chair beside his bed. "My sister," he said, and the word landed in the quiet room like something heavy set down carefully. "Cho's people killed her 4 years ago. She was not involved in any of this. She had left the organization entirely, built a life for herself outside of it, and they killed her anyway, to send me a message about territory I had refused to hand over. I have spent 4 years making sure nothing I care about is ever visible enough to be used against me again." Maya crossed the room slowly and sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair, she realized, where he had fallen asleep holding her hand. "And now," she said gently. "And now there is you," Jay said, and his voice had gone rough in a way she had never heard from him. "And I do not know how to want something without it becoming a liability. I have not known how to do that in 4 years. I'm not asking you to protect me from wanting me," Maya said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I walked into this house 4 months ago because I needed the money, and I've watched you build walls around everything you're afraid to lose. I'm not naive about what that means, or about what you are, or about what happened to that man in your basement. But I'm still here. I'm choosing to still be here." Jay rose from behind the desk and crossed to her slowly, and when he reached for her it was with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything, his hand cupping her jaw the way it had in the hallway, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "You should run," he said quietly, though his hand did not release her. "Every part of me that still functions rationally is telling me to send you away from this house tonight, for your own safety." "I already told you," Maya said. "I don't run from things just because they're dangerous. I never have." He kissed her then, slow and certain, one hand still cradling her face, the other coming to rest at the small of her back as though he was afraid, even now, that she might simply disappear if he did not hold on. Maya kissed him back with a certainty that surprised her, for months of careful invisibility burning away in the warmth of his hands, and when they finally broke apart, Jay rested his forehead against hers and exhaled a breath that sounded like something releasing after years of being held. "This is the most reckless thing I have done in 4 years, he murmured. "Good," Maya said. "You could use a little recklessness." The confrontation with Cho's people came 6 days later, and it came without warning, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon when Maya was least prepared for it. She had gone to the greenhouse at the edge of the property, one of the few places on the grounds she was still permitted to move through freely, to cut fresh flowers for the dining room, and had not noticed the 2 men following her from the tree line until it was nearly too late. She heard the crunch of gravel behind her a half-second before instinct sent her spinning around, the shears she had been using to cut stems still clutched in her hand, and found herself facing 2 men she had never seen before, both of them moving with the same predatory calculation she remembered from the man in the hallway weeks earlier. "Han's new favorite," one of them said, and the way he said it made her skin crawl. "Cho wants a word with you." Maya did not scream. She did not freeze. She had learned, in the weeks since the hallway attack, that hesitation cost precious seconds she could not afford to lose, and instead she threw the only weapon she had, a fistful of loose soil from the potted plant beside her, directly into the nearest man's eyes, and used the half-second of his blinded confusion to drive the garden shears into his forearm with every ounce of desperate strength she possessed. He screamed and stumbled back, and Maya was already running, sprinting back toward the main house through the rows of greenhouse plants, her lungs burning. The second man close behind her, close enough that she could hear his ragged breathing over her own. She burst through the greenhouse door into the open grounds just as Jay's security detail rounded the corner of the main house. Alerted, she would learn later, by a silent alarm triggered the moment she had breached the tree line's motion sensors, and the second man skidded to a halt at the sight of armed men closing in from every direction, his hands rising slowly in surrender. Jay reached her moments later, having sprinted the distance from the house himself, his composure entirely abandoned for the first time since she had known him, his hands running over her shoulders and arms as though checking for injuries with a desperation that had nothing to do with calculation and everything to do with fear. "I'm fine," Maya said, though her voice was shaking. "I got one of them with the shears." "I've fine." Jay pulled her against his chest, his arms closing around her with a fierceness that stole the breath from her lungs, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the sound of his heartbeat hammering against her ear the only thing anchoring her to the ground. "Cho sent them himself," Sung-hoon reported grimly, jogging up with the captured man secured between two of his soldiers. "He's done testing the waters." This was a direct move. "Then we finish this today," Jay said, and the coldness had returned to his voice entirely, though his hand remained fixed at the small of Maya's back, unwilling to let go even as he issued orders. "I want his location within the hour." Maya stepped back to look at him properly, understanding immediately what he intended, the same reckless certainty rising in her chest that had carried her through the greenhouse moments earlier. "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not," Jay said, his jaw tightening. "This is not something I will allow." "You don't get to allow or disallow anything about me," Maya said, holding his gaze steadily despite the fear still coursing through her veins. "Cho already knows what I am to you. Hiding me away now doesn't protect me. It just makes me easier to find later. I want to see this ended as much as you do." Jay studied her for a long moment, the same searching, unreadable focus she had come to recognize as the truest version of him, and finally, reluctantly, he nodded. The confrontation took place that evening in a warehouse near the industrial docks that Cho had been using as a staging ground, and Maya watched from behind a line of Jay's men as the negotiation between the two organizations unraveled with terrifying speed into violence. She was not meant to be near the fighting, positioned deliberately at the rear of the formation, but when one of Cho's men slipped past the perimeter and came at Jay from behind while his attention was fixed on Cho himself, Maya did not hesitate. She grabbed a length of pipe from a stack of construction materials nearby and swung it with every bit of strength she had left, catching the man across the shoulder hard enough to send him sprawling, buying Jay the half-second of warning he needed to turn and finish the fight himself, precise and economical and utterly without mercy. Cho went down permanently, and Maya would learn later that Jay had made a decision in that warehouse that ended the conflict for good, a decision she did not ask him to elaborate on, and he did not offer to explain, understanding without words that some parts of his world would always remain his alone to carry. In the aftermath, standing amid the wreckage of the warehouse with sirens beginning to sound distantly in the direction of the docks, signaling that Jay's people would need to move quickly to clear the scene, Jay turned to her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something unguarded and raw and entirely without the careful composure he wore like armor everywhere else. "You should not have been here," he said, but there was no real anger in it, only something that sounded almost like awe. "You be dead if I wasn't," Maya said, still breathing hard, the pipe still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. "I know," Jay said quietly, and reached out to gently pry the pipe from her hands, setting it aside, his fingers lingering against hers the way they had that very first morning in his bedroom. "I am no longer interested in pretending this is anything other than what it is, Maya. I do not simply want you near me because you make this house feel less like a fortress. I want you because in 4 months you have become the only thing in my life that feels like it belongs to me rather than to my name. Maya felt something in her chest loosen entirely, the last of her careful, professional distance finally giving way. I fell asleep in your bed by accident, she said, and woke up holding your hand. I think some part of me knew exactly what that meant before either of us was ready to say it out loud. 3 weeks later, the household had settled into a new and quieter rhythm, one that no longer required Maya to be invisible in quite the same way she once had. She still worked, because she had told Jay plainly and without room for argument that she had no interest in becoming a woman who did nothing with her days, and he had, after an initial and predictable resistance, arranged instead for her to oversee the household staff directly, a role that used her competence and her steady judgment rather than simply her willingness to disappear into corners. On a quiet evening in early autumn, Maya found Jay in the same chair beside his bed where she had first woken to find him asleep, his hand curled loosely around hers exactly as it had been that morning months ago, except now she was awake to feel it happen, watching the low gold light fall across his face as he studied her with the same unreadable focus that had once frightened her and now simply felt like home. They will always come for what I have, Jay said quietly, his thumb tracing slow circles against the back of her hand. Cho was not the last enemy I will ever make. I need you to understand that before you decide this is something you want permanently. I decided that in a hospital gown in your bed, half convinced I was dreaming, Maya said. I've had months to change my mind since then. I haven't. Jay lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, slow and deliberate, the kind of gesture that would have seemed impossible from the man who once emptied hallways with his footsteps. Then stay, he said simply. Not because I am asking you to be safe. Because I am asking you to be mine, with everything that costs. Maya looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had once been a rumor whispered carefully through marble hallways, now nothing more or less than a man sitting beside her, waiting for an answer he had clearly already guessed. I already am, she said. I think I have been since the morning I woke up holding your hand instead of letting go.